Welcome to the Critical Media Studies Podcast. We're your hosts, Mike Rapici
and Barry Falk.
Dr. Michael, how are you?
Dr. Barry, I'm well. How are you?
I'm doing fine. I'm excited to be talking about, as I always am in our conversations, excited to be talking about Evgeny Morozov. And my main feeling about Evgeny Morozov in particular, we're talking about a 2013. This is one of the powerful things about this and one of the exciting things about this. I have just discovered Evgeny Morozov. We're talking about a New Yorker essay that he wrote called Only Disconnect. And it's from 2013, but I feel it's extremely timely and extremely relevant, whereas so much media theory is kind of immediately invalid after its sell-by date, and the sell-by date is usually about a month after it's published, right? In this case, we're looking at an essay that is almost is over 10 years old, and I'm thinking it is extremely relevant to our circumstances and for our purposes, dear Dr. Mike. It's relevant for us in that Morozov is taking up an issue or using some similar terms, some of the terms that we were bandying about when we were talking about the essay by Romero. Is it Alberto Romero?
Yes.
And his essay on the need for radical boredom or the need for boredom, or the need to avoid, put it more positively, the need to avoid the lure of distraction that's offered constantly by our media devices. And in this 2013 essay, Morozov raises a lot of the same questions and issues, and also proffers a kind of similar solution to the problem of the issue of media distraction that Romero contemplates. But I would say that he frames the problem in a more congenial way, and in a way I think is more, here's what I really like about him. I find it a more practical solution to the problem of constant media distraction than the solution that Romero offers. I'm going to let you talk now, but I can be more explicit about what Morozov is doing.
Before we jump in,
we can talk about the essay in general.
Before we jump in, I want you to explain.
Let's jump in.
No,
let's not jump in.
I want to know why. Did you say you feel like this was a more practical take?
Hell yes, because I think it's more practical in one sense. More practical in that, well, I'm going to partly get into the business of describing Morozov's essay, but we can return to it and fill in the picture. But I'll try and answer your question directly by sort of, jumping ahead a little bit and saying what Morozov, trying to paraphrase or summarize what Morozov talks about. So Morozov is interested in this question of, he worries, like Romero does, about the enticements of the internet and the many distractions and pleasures, the pleasurable distractions that the internet offers us. He is concerned, like Romero was, that if we make too much avail of it, that we're going to be stupid. We're going to be perpetually distracted and no longer, shades of Bernard Stiegler, shades of a lot of people we read, no longer able to think because we're always on the media turntable, whirlwind, whatever.
Right.
Because we're constantly chasing our own pleasure. Now, Romero, you'll remember, says, we got to be willing to sit still in our room. And he quotes Pascal saying, like, sometimes we just have to sit still in our room. And Romero says, we got to embrace boredom. And I think, as I recall our last episode, we were trying to think of ways in which we were trying to paint that as a positive picture, because paint that in a positive, let me start again. We're trying to think of a positive way to frame Romero's solution to the problem of media distraction, constant internet distraction. And we were trying to um, think of ways in which we could think of boredom,
Mm-hmm.
not something that anyone wants to embrace. So we were trying to think of positive ways to do it. I don't really remember. I mean, my best recollection of what we were saying, I was trying to paint being bored positively, and I was thinking just maybe it means pockets of quiet. I don't know,
Yeah,
something
we
like
we we
yeah,
we we tried to connect it to Stiegler's idea of noesis, where we're essentially
dreaming,
stepping
daydreaming,
away
not
and
doing productive work.
daydreaming.
Right, right. Okay, so I'll try and round out the answer to your question. So we were talking about how we're trying to give a positive spin to the boredom, to the embrace of boredom that Romero is calling for. I feel now I answer your question directly. Morozov is working the same terrain, but I feel it's a more practical answer, and by practical than Romero proffers, because I think one of the problems of Romero's contemplation or suggestions on the problem, one of the problems with it is that no matter how hard you try, you can't sell the idea that you should always be bored just because it's better for you. It's like you can't always be eating your broccoli. Now, I mean, you can't say, well, you need to eat your broccoli more. In fact, you should be eating your broccoli all the damn time and
Mm-hmm.
get off the internet. Eat your broccoli. I don't think that's practical. And what I think is more practical by Morozov, this is what I mean by saying he's addressing the problem, but I think it's more practical. So I'm trying to answer your question is that he doesn't make it Morozov isn't just telling you eat your broccoli. He isn't counseling you to have, he's counseling you to have quiet time like Romero does. But he's not saying you should only lust after and long for the quiet time. He admits the lure of the internet. Morozov admits that we like the internet for a reason. We like it precisely because it distracts us.
Mm-hmm.
And Romero kind of wants to push that away and discount it and say, no, no, eat your broccoli. I see Morozov as being more practical, i.e., more suited to human nature, because he's saying, listen, we know you don't always want to eat your broccoli. We know there are times you want fill in your favorite food here. But let's think about the internet and the possibilities in both um, uh, as a let's think of the internet as a pharmacon in a way. It's positive and negative. It's distracting you, and distraction is not a bad thing in and of itself. It can be a good thing. Some distraction is okay. It's cool. It's all right to like. That's what I read him as saying. And maybe you're reading it differently, but
Well, no, I
that's
think
why I called it more practical.
okay, no, that I think that's interesting. I actually, and I didn't catch this until you started talking, and I went and took a peek at the article again. One of the things he does that I think is interesting, and you're right, Romero seems to really portion off this notion of boredom as something unto itself
Something unto
that
itself. Right.
is
Right.
is like our vegetables, right?
Yeah.
We need
Make
it.
sure you eat them no matter what.
And he's now you got you know I want to give him credit. He's not at all wrong when he's saying there's this sort of narcotic pull to to the distraction that the web offers us. Morozov does something really fascinating, and so I think it's important first to say that he's channeling Krakauer a lot here, and
Siegfried Krakauer, and let's just give him a little bit of context, German thinker in the same circles as Theodor Adorno and Walter Benjamin. So, dare I say, Krakauer is a friend of this podcast.
yeah, and we will return to
Dare
him.
I say?
We'll return to him in short order. But so to summarize very briefly, he talks about Krakauer's article arguing that back in the 20s, people were overstimulated and suffering
Or
from
worried about being
worried about
overstimulated. The
but
media was
really
overstimulated.
a frighteningly astute observation of the what we say maybe the limits of attention and the consequences perhaps of exceeding those limits. But um, there's an interesting moment, I'd say about two-thirds of the way through this essay. And I want to read this actually because I think that Morozov hits kind of something really interesting that I missed it the first time. But he's talking about um, the the train. And here, let me jump into this, okay? Um, For what is modernity, if not a collection of pockets of silence and distraction? Consider the Amtrak train. Yes, we get Wi Fi, but we also get the quiet car. And is there a more beloved and trusted American institution today than the quiet car? And he goes on a little bit later and he says, the idea that trains can be places of sacred disconnection would puzzle Flaubert. This shouldn't detract us from cultivating our own gardens of connection or disconnection. This would invariably involve creating zones that run on different rules of media engagement. So here he's really talking not about this isn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? This is like, look,
No.
we just
And
need
it
to
isn't
be.
only eat your isn't only eat your broccoli and get used to broccoli. Make sure you eat it.
No, he's being mindful that maybe there are better ways of engaging. But this is so
Yeah,
you skip for a little bit. He says these gardens won't be built until we stop treating boredom and distraction as somehow at odds with each other.
there you go.
And
That's
that was fascinating to me. Krakauer,
yeah,
for one, never did. As much as he favored radical boredom, he neither disdained,
right.
he disdained neither modern technologies nor the masses with their penchant for dance, travel, and slapstick films. On the contrary, all these diversions, he thought, could help sabotage modernity's efforts to shove people, quote,
Right.
into an everyday life that turns them into henchmen of the technological excesses. So, to me, what's really fascinating about this is that he has married this idea of boredom and distraction,
Right.
leveraged differently as a means of combating the very thing
Absolutely.
that a different version of boredom and distraction.
Absolutely right. That's a key point. That's a key point. And the key point that you make is that, and this, I think, is what I love the Romero essay, so that I'm not bashing it, but I think this is a more intellectually helpful move. This is more, I won't say intellectually helpful. I think it's just a more helpful move to think of these things to think of boredom and distraction. So you have a binary basically in Romero.
Mhm.
It's boredom versus distraction. And
And
what,
let me pause you for a
please,
second there. The idea there, I think, is that distraction is all encompassing and
right,
is
right, right,
this sort of vapid pursuit, right? It's
right.
hollow. Whereas boredom, as Romero's looking at it, is more of this. Well, I'm going to sort of recycle my argument from last time, right? This sort of Stiglerian open space where you can
Absolutely.
dream
It's
and
an
think.
openness and an emptiness that's beautiful and it could be filled with great things as opposed to boredom, as opposed to distraction, rather.
Whereas, so how would you then qualify or characterize Morozov's notion of boredom and distraction?
Well, the main thing to be said about it, I think there are many things to be said about it that we can talk about, but I think the main thing we can say about it, the first thing to be said about it is this: unlike Romero, he's not separating the two.
Mm-mm.
Whatever he's suggesting about media, and here he follows Siegfried Krakauer, and Krakauer's purposely dialectical, i.e., non-binary approach to film. Film both distracts you and allows you, what's the opposite of distraction? Allows you a place for
Being idle.
being idle. Right, right. In a productive way, idleness
Mm-hmm.
in a productive way. So, in the same way that Krakauer refuses to think about the new media of his day, film, in a binary way, it's all good or all bad. Um, Morozov is refusing categorically to separate the pole of distraction, from the pole of boredom. Instead, he's urging us to think of, as Krakauer did, to think of, to think in terms of a media environment or ecology that encompasses both poles of the spectrum. And
Hmm.
that, I think, is what I was saying is both more practical, but I think is even more intellectually flexible. I just think it's a better move overall than what Romero finally counsels us to do.
So I have one more question about this,
Sure.
because it seems that the answer here, as Morozov is putting it, is look, it's not that these new media are inherently bad.
Bad.
You're just
Right.
using them in a way that prejudices them to,
One pole over another.
yes. So
That's it.
it would
And
be
that's the
easy.
problem, right?
Well, right. So it would be easy to take that one step further and say, look, it's not being plugged in that's the problem. It's the nature of that being plugged in, which needs to be reconsidered. And I think he's very good at leaving room for this argument to sort of take root. So why is he called this essay only disconnect? Because
Well, he may
because
have
that
sacrificed. Oh, go ahead. I'm
no, I was
sorry.
just saying, because that seems at odd. Like, when you
It
look at
does.
this, you know what we're talking about new media here, right? And we're saying, okay, and this is an article essentially on the value of boredom, radical boredom, right? And radical distraction. And so it's easy to sort of terminologically jump to conclusions and say, okay, look, we have to kill the machines. We have to go lie,
Right, right. Only
on our
this.
back and stare at the sky. That I'm curious as to how, and by the way, I did not mean this as a gotcha question. I'm literally looking down at this. I'm like,
No,
wow,
I mean, I think I have the answer to it.
I'd love to hear
Yeah,
it,
I
because
don't feel it's gotcha.
okay, no,
Uh,
because I'm
but
not trying to do that.
but but go ahead. I'm sorry.
So why only disconnect? Like, what is it that we are disconnecting from if it's a question of the nature of the engagement, not the engagement itself?
Well, I said I have the answer to this, and maybe I don't, but I suspect that what happened is this. The title is not dialectical because the title is referring to E.M. Forster to Howard's End. The main motif in Howard's End is that the characters strive, the best characters, the protagonists of Howard's End, they're always urging us to connect. And the narrator even says, only connect. That becomes a slogan of Howard's End. So he's making a pun. He's saying, instead of Forster's only connect, and that way leads to mental happiness, he's saying only disconnect. So, let me finish the finish the point. I think he sacrificed. So it's a funny nod to Ian Forster, but it doesn't do justice for his argument because his argument is not only disconnect. His
Okay.
argument, like you say, the title is at odds with the essay that follows because the essay is smart. And in fact, the whole essay is at odds with the title because he immediately cites Krakauer, and
Hmm.
Krakauer's whole thing is to not disconnect, but to connect to media, to connect to films. Don't be afraid of films.
Hmm.
So the whole essay is at odds with the title, but I think he just wanted to make a joke.
Oh,
Ha
I don't like not getting the joke.
ha.
Okay.
Oh well, it's not a big deal. It's not a big
No,
deal.
no,
I'm just
I'm
saying. I think that, and I may be wrong, but I think that's what's going on there. Is that the title is simplistic, and the essay we're admiring it for not being simplistic.
So let me ask you one more question in the same vein, because this is how
Mhm,
he wraps his
mhm,
argument up here, and I think that
mhm,
this was the question for me. He says both radical boredom and radical distraction, and I take those to be Krakauer's terms,
mhm.
um, can get us closer to such, quote, authentic rapture within the inauthentic domain. He says the trick is to honor and celebrate both of them and not settle for their tepid, mediocre versions. So we understand that the what seem to be at opposite ends of the pole here, boredom and distraction, are really just on the same coin, right? They're
On
not
the
they're
same
not
coin. Right,
oppositional
right,
here.
right, right,
Um,
right.
so, but there is a difference between the radical version of these and their tepid, mediocre versions. And I'm wondering, because I don't get a sense here that Morozov gives us really any indication of where he draws that line between something radical and something mediocre. And,
Mhm.
to me, the distinction would necessarily lie in two places, right?
Mhm.
One, are we properly oriented to media in a way that avoids being tepid and mediocre? So have we managed to align ourselves with these media in a way that helps us to do something positive, right? To yield positive, productive boredom as opposed to this sort of empty, stagnant plate, right? Um, but also, I have to feel like this has something to do with the nature of our engagement, not just the
Mhm.
nature of our connection, but how we actually. Because to me, right, like just being outside of something,
Mhm.
but being fully inert, that cannot be radical, right? That if you're just a bump on a log, so to speak, right? There's nothing radical about that. You're taking up space. I mean, I don't take a whole lot of difference between that and staring at the worst, that YouTube has to offer. So to me, it has to do not just with how we're aligned, but also the nature of our engagements once we're aligned properly. I don't know
Hmm.
where that is though. What, like, because because the second we start to attach value to that,
Mhm.
I have a hard time seeing that as boredom or distraction. I'm wondering how you understand that.
Hmm. A couple things here. Before I answer that directly, we probably should say something about we're late in the game on this, but maybe it's worth sort of
This is good
saying something
podcasting.
about Morozov, like where
Okay.
he's coming from. I
Okay.
mean, I just know some basic things, and maybe let me use that as a kind of way of sort of prefacing the answer. I'm sorry.
Sure, sure. Go ahead.
Okay. Um, uh, j- so just to sort of orient listeners who may not be aware of Morozov, and I was one of those people who wasn't aware of Morozov until Michael pointed me out. But um, I think this is pertinent because I find his position as articulated in this essay a little bit at odds with his other work and where he comes from. So Morozov is from Belarus, and he kind of made a name for himself. You were talking about the book you're familiar with, Michael.
Hmm.
Was it the Net Effect or
The
something
net
like this?
delusion.
Net Delusion. Well, and that's it. The title says it all. Um, his basic first strike in media theory was like against the people who said, the only thing you need in Belarus, the only thing China needs right now is a good Google washing or a good Google whacking. As soon as
Hmm.
they get the internet, as soon as they get the internet, there's going to be a revolution in China. As soon as Google gets behind, the I don't know, penetrates China's barriers, everything is going to be different. And the same thing in the former Soviet Union. Once you give these people Google and once they get on YouTube, we're all going to be having this planetary consciousness. And
Right, right.
his first intervention is the net isn't all that. The net isn't all that. Chances are, in fact, not chances are, what he saw on the ground in Belarus, that's why I bring it up. What
Hmm.
he saw on the ground in Belarus is that you can give people internet devices and access to platforms. But what they tend to do is sort of replicate the most mundane kinds of
Right,
behavior and
right.
interactions and things. Okay. So it's kind of interesting. So given that that's what how he made his name in media theory, this sort of dissenting argument to this idea that technology is always empowering and always enabling and always enables democratic decision making and processes. It's kind of interesting that this isn't just a dig at the internet, right? So getting back now to a more direct answer to your question, um, I find it interesting that he isn't saying get off the internet and only go to safe spaces, but that he kind of likes the fact that the internet distracts us to no purpose, gives us entertainment that is quote unquote mindless.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he kind of says that's part of modernity. For him, the experience of being modern, and he's using that term in the same way that somebody like Walter Benjamin or Siegfried Kracauer would have used it, like part of modernity writ large, but more specifically, um, Morozov is thinking about our particular moment of digital modernity, and he's saying the same thing that Krakauer said in regard to film. Don't be afraid of film. It has some positive things, it has some negative things. Make sure that you use it along with other things. Okay, now allow me a quick answer. Now I was digressive.
No, no, no.
Allow me a quick
That was
answer
helpful.
to your a quick answer to your question about what's he on about in terms of degrees of how do you characterize or distinguish radical boredom from tepid boredom or
Mm-hmm.
radical distraction from bad distraction or deadening distraction. Well, okay, I'm going to skirt the question a little bit by saying I don't know if I have an answer to that, and I don't think Morozov makes it clear. But working in the same passage that you read from, I want to read another sentence, pick up where you left off. And here I think he does give a good Krakauer inspired answer to your question. So a little bit later on, not too far from where you were reading, Michael, he says this, and I like the fact that he's enlisting Krakauer. I like, this is worth saying. I like the fact that even though he's talking about digital culture and he's very concerned about digital culture, he quotes Krakauer with respect and that he feels that there's something to be learned by from these older media critics who are talking about the new media of their day. So I like that aspect of his essay as well. But anyway, he quotes, I'll just read briefly this one sentence here. Krakauer wrote a celebrated essay on the distracting potential of the cinema. But it's in his essay on travel and dance that reaffirms the need to create diverse pockets of experience. Krakauer saw travel and dance as strategies to suspend the growing rationalization of modern life. And now I promise I'll quit talking, but I'll sum up now an answer to your question, and it hopefully will be fairly concise, at least in my terms, and at least concise as far as Barry Falk gets. So I don't think he gives a good answer to your question about the degrees of boredom and distraction that we should be striving. I don't know if he provides a good answer to your excellent question, but I think he does answer your question elsewhere in this second invocation of Krakauer, which is very much in keeping with this idea of media ecologies and media environmentalism that he wants to. I mean, when he says Krakauer feels that there are practices in modernity that allow you to be modern and a kind of internal, that also allow you a kind of internal distance from your modernity. And so there's a way in which travel is deadening and enlivening. There's a way in which dance is automatic in Krakauer's view.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Dance is automatic and deadening, but also enlivening. The fact that there are pockets of modernity that allow you to be both bored and distracted, engaged and disengaged, that's what you should be searching for. So to me, I think that's the real answer, the real solution, not this idea of like there are degrees of boredom and
No,
distraction. Is that
I think your answer was actually profoundly helpful to me because as I'm thinking about it, you know, and the more we talk about it, the more that this essay and this argument really do become profoundly pragmatic and not at all dogmatic, right? He's not saying good, bad, he's not offering specific direction. I think what he's looking at here is, hey, you know, there are multiple ways to engage with new media, right? Some of them are cat videos on YouTube, and that's a thing. And that's a thing you can do. And that is, I'm guessing here that that probably constitutes tepid boredom or tepid distraction. And they don't necessarily need to be different, right? Because again, this is going to be largely contextual. But I think what he's also looking at is that, hey, you know, these notions of boredom and distraction, like the internet itself, are really idiosyncratic. And I
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
think
yeah,
I
yeah,
and
yeah,
I
yeah,
think that this nature, the
yeah.
nature of this argument is basically saying, look, the answer that I'm about to give here is not the same for you and for me, but
Right, right,
certainly
right.
but
I agree.
certainly you can do better than cat videos. Whatever that is for you, that's what you
I
should
like
be
that.
doing. That, I think, is what he would call radical. Like there's nothing inherently, and this is unsatisfying in a way, but I think it's right. There's nothing inherently right or wrong or good or bad because it depends on what your personal, what your ideology is. Where are you?
Well, that is in keeping with the strategy that he's advocating that we like, which
Hmm.
is he's not saying I like what you're saying a lot because you're saying he's asking us to be able to pivot and modulate and be, embrace different kinds of things to create our media environment. And that's in keeping with what we seem to like about the essay, which is it's not a question of either or. Let's
Hmm.
be bored or let's be, distracted.
Well, I think, and it's been a long time since I read The Net Delusion. But to me, I think that he was pushing back a bit against this idea that, the Arab Spring was created by Twitter and
Very
and
much
and
so.
and
Very much
and
so.
that the internet is going to revolutionize and democratize
Right.
everything.
Yeah.
I think he's
Yeah.
probably looking at saying, look, it's a tool, and
It's a tool.
ultimately what
Right.
you should do is something interesting with it that can be
Right.
radical versus,
Right.
you know,
Right.
um, the stuff that's just distracting but not productive in some way.
And let me linger on what you just said or elaborate on something you just said right here because it's a kind of key point. I think this tells us a lot about Morozov's general approach to media, and it is one of the things I like about his writing and why I want to read more about him. Um, he really is a great demystifier of the claims that kind of the countercultural claims that lingered a lot. This idea that just to get on the internet is going to be a revolution.
Right.
It's just going to be a crazy, we're going to be one step closer to a new step in human evolution just by logging on.
Hmm.
Some of the exaggerated claims that were kind of par for the course about 10, 20 years ago in the days of, in the Steve Jobs era and things like this, where this sense of what just get a computer and then the world will be different and better. And then that argument kind of resurfaced again with the collapse of the Soviet Union, or gained a new kind of edge with the collapse of the Soviet Union and with the Arab Spring, with the example of the Arab Spring. And he was one of the kind of demystifiers of this notion that the net necessarily equal the net is more, technology is more than a tool. It's the revolution. It is the apocalypse.
Hmm.
He's always been sort of working against that idea.
Well, I think, and this is gonna, I think that there's a lot of people listening to this who probably will this is my version of the E.M. Forrester joke, I guess. When computers first became widely available, it was going to be this revolutionary thing, right? And everybody just played solitaire.
Right.
And
Right.
that's his argument in a nutshell. I mean, before there was YouTube, there was solitaire, and you have this
Well,
machine that does all these wonderful things, but we're always just that. I'm gonna absolutely squander the opportunity because that's what we do, and so I think that's what he's calling for.
he made a similar. I was watching a documentary, and I don't remember the name of it, but there's a YouTube documentary that he did for Dutch television.
Hmm.
I haven't finished watching it, but I'm reminded of what you just said. His specific example from Belarus is he said, the first thing that maybe everybody is going to do when they get the internet is they'll look for porn.
Hmm.
There's
Hmm.
an assumption, and let me give you the whole context of the argument because it does tell you a lot about his art. It tells you a lot about his take on media and why I think it's kind of refreshing. So what he's arguing against is the assumption that the first thing that will happen if you give the internet to, in his example, he was talking about former Soviet republics. And he was saying that there's an assumption that Westerners have that the first thing that will happen is that they'll immediately start searching for human rights violations.
Right.
And that they will first, they'll find out more about democracy. The first thing that will happen is that they'll start, violating. Okay, well, how is my government violating human rights? What are the human rights violations around me? And how can I find out more about American democracy? And he's saying, well, the reality is probably everybody is looking at cat videos or porn. That's the first thing they're going to end up doing.
That's funny.
So, yeah. I like his, and this is kind of why I was calling him pragmatic, because in a way, a lot of his critique is just this, dare I say it, kind of commonsensical critique of the wildly inflated claims. Maybe they're not made anymore, Michael, but they used to be made, right?
But they used
I'll tell you, made that internet will just revolutionize everything. You just need a computer.
You know what? No, they are being made. And they're being made, and I think with different language, but the heart and soul is still there. I mean, we get this in education, right? Where if you throw technology at kids, it will solve the problem.
It will solve the problem,
right? And this notion, and I think the educational analog here, right, is this, and this goes back probably 10 years or so, maybe about the little after he was writing this, was this idea about the digital natives and the problems with our students was that we just weren't reaching them because they speak a much more advanced language than we do.
Much more advanced language. And they're the next step of evolution. See, I like him for sort of puncturing those common sense ideas and kind of reminding us that in the spirit of this podcast, right? Technology is technology. Tools are tools. Finally, at the end of the day, tools are tools. Technology is technology. It's not the apocalypse.
No. Well, I think that's a good place to end.
That's a good place to end.
Barry, this was a good conversation. I enjoyed this.
I hope so. Michael. It was a lot of fun talking about him. And I think in the future, we might have more, let's forecast this. We might have more Morozov. We might have more Krakauer. And we might have other things in our future, right? But those two might be among them.
I think so.
Possibly.
All right. Well, Barry, have a wonderful evening, and we'll catch up again soon.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Michael. Take care.
All right, Barry. Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Critical Media Studies podcast. To find out more about the show, check out our webpage at criticalmediastudiespodcast.com.